Why won't you answer me? Yeah! Look at me when I'm talking to you. This is absolutely ridiculous.
Rich tourists spat on the royal guard's face. What happened next was truly unforgettable. Among them, the soft hum of chatter mixed with the clicks of cameras, the occasional squeal of excitement from children, and the rhythmic footsteps of the palace guards as they maintained their watch. It was a scene of order and beauty, the kind that made every visitor feel like they were witnessing history in the making. Charles Whitmore, a man in his late 40s, stepped out of the sleek black limousine that had brought him to the palace gates. Dressed in designer clothes, sunglasses perched on his nose, and an expensive watch gleaming in the sun, he immediately drew attention, not because he wanted to, but because people naturally noticed wealth and confidence. Charles had traveled the world countless times, staying in luxury hotels, eating at the finest restaurants, and visiting famous landmarks. Yet, for all his experience, there was something about the palace guards that irked him. Perhaps it was their unwavering discipline, their refusal to move even for a perfect photograph, or simply his frustration at having to follow rules that seemed inconvenient to him. Whatever the reason, his impatience was bubbling beneath the surface. As Charles approached the main courtyard, he saw guard Jameson, a tall, imposing figure with a straight back and a face that seemed carved from stone. Jameson had served in the palace for over 15 years and had seen almost everything: crowds of tourists, pranksters, even occasional disrespectful behavior. Yet he remained calm and professional, carrying out his duty with quiet pride. Today, like every other day, he stood motionless, his eyes forward, his expression unchanged, a living symbol of the palace's dignity and order. Charles, however, did not see dignity. All he saw was an obstacle preventing him from capturing the perfect selfie. He tried to step closer, but Jameson did not flinch. He did not bend, move, or smile for the camera. Charles frowned, muttering under his breath about how ridiculous it was that someone would refuse to comply with such a simple request. He waved his hand, hoping the guard would take notice. The guard did not. Charles tried again, this time speaking louder, demanding politely at first, then with visible frustration. Yet Jameson remained still. Each second that passed seemed to increase Charles's anger. The courtyard around him continued to buzz with activity, tourists marveling at the guards, snapping pictures, and occasionally stepping aside to let others through. But Charles felt trapped, irritated by the rules he had come to see as unnecessary. In that moment, Charles made a decision he would later regret. Feeling that authority and wealth should allow him to bend rules, he acted on impulse. He leaned forward and spat on Jameson's face. The act was shocking, violent in its disrespect, yet it came from a place of arrogance rather than malice. The sound of the spit hitting the guard's cheek was faint but carried across the courtyard like an invisible hammer. Time seemed to slow for a heartbeat as the people around them realized what had happened. Tourists froze mid-photo, children stopped squealing, and a silence fell over the courtyard heavier than any crowd noise. Jameson did not react immediately. He remained calm, his eyes steady, his jaw tight. He had faced anger and provocation before, but nothing quite like this. Every muscle in his body was trained to maintain composure. His uniform, pristine and flawless, became a symbol of control, and his stillness seemed almost unshakable. Meanwhile, Charles stepped back, perhaps expecting a reaction, a flinch, or a shout, but Jameson gave none. Confusion flashed across Charles's face. This was not the reaction he had anticipated. He had imagined surprise, fear, maybe even an apology, but instead he saw the unwavering gaze of someone who would not be moved by wealth, power, or intimidation. Around them, whispers began to spread like wildfire. "Did he really just spit on the guard?" someone asked, their voice trembling in disbelief. "I can't believe he did that," another whispered, recording the moment on their phone. The courtyard, once full of excited chatter, now buzzed with tension and disbelief. People instinctively stepped back, forming a circle, creating space as if witnessing something dangerous. Charles, sensing the attention, felt a mix of anger and embarrassment. How dare these ordinary people stare at him? Didn't they recognize his status, his money, the life he had built? He waved his hands, trying to dismiss them, but it was too late. Every eye was on him, every camera phone pointed directly at his face. Jameson, meanwhile, continued to stand perfectly still. His training told him exactly what to do in such a situation. Do not retaliate, do not show anger, do not escalate. He waited for the palace security team to arrive, his mind focused on maintaining professionalism rather than engaging with the man who had insulted him. Tourists began to murmur among themselves, some expressing outrage, others simply astonished at the calmness of the guard. A few children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking why the man had spat and why the guard wasn't angry. The courtyard, filled with awe and tension, seemed to pause in that moment, holding its collective breath. Charles, frustrated and now publicly humiliated, tried to explain himself. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said, his voice rising. "It's just a joke, can't you see that?" But his words fell flat. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved to console him. The cameras kept recording, capturing his angry gestures, his reddened face, and the stunned expressions of everyone around him. The more he spoke, the more he looked foolish. Wealth, it seemed, could not buy dignity or respect in this moment. At that precise time, a security officer approached. Calm but firm, he placed a hand on Charles's shoulder. "Sir, please come with me," he said. Charles resisted at first, arguing and trying to use his charm to avoid consequences. But the officer's authority was clear, unyielding, and backed by the law. Slowly, reluctantly, Charles allowed himself to be led away, his ego bruised far more than his body. The tourists watched as the man who had thought himself untouchable was escorted from the palace grounds, the reality of his actions settling in as the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. As the commotion died down, attention returned to guard Jameson. His face, though slightly damp from the spit, remained composed. There was a quiet strength in his eyes, a message unspoken but clearly understood. Disrespect may come and go, but dignity is enduring. People began to approach him from a distance, offering polite words of admiration, snapping pictures carefully, and whispering their appreciation. In that moment, Jameson became more than just a guard. He became a symbol of patience, self-control, and the quiet power of standing firm. For Charles, the incident was the beginning of a humbling journey. In that courtyard, under the watchful eyes of tourists and royalty alike, he had learned a lesson in the most public and unforgettable way possible. What had started as impatience and arrogance ended with the realization that wealth and privilege could not protect him from the consequences of his own actions. And while the story would spread far beyond the palace walls, the image of a calm, composed guard standing tall in the face of disrespect would remain etched in everyone's memory. After the shocking incident in the palace courtyard, the atmosphere was tense. The tourists who had witnessed it were still whispering among themselves, their phones buzzing with notifications as videos of the moment were already circulating online. Some people shook their heads in disbelief, others gasped quietly, and a few muttered about how they could never imagine someone acting so arrogantly. Charles Whitmore, meanwhile, had been escorted to a side office by the palace security officers. His face was red with embarrassment and anger, but he refused to admit the seriousness of what he had done. In his mind, he was a man of influence and money, and surely that would give him some advantage. Inside the office, a team of palace officials and security personnel waited. They had already been briefed about the situation, and now it was time to deal with the consequences. The head of palace security, a calm and authoritative woman named Ms. Harlow, took charge. She had decades of experience in handling difficult situations involving visitors and was known for her fairness and firmness. She looked at Charles with a mixture of sternness and professional curiosity. "Sir, we need to discuss what happened in the courtyard," she said, her voice calm but commanding. Spitting on a royal guard is a serious offense. It cannot be overlooked. I'm a paying visitor. I've spent a lot to come here and I don't see why I should be treated like this. His tone was arrogant, as though money and social status could excuse any action. Ms. Harlow did not react to his words. She remained calm, her eyes steady. Sir, respect and rules are not negotiable here, regardless of wealth or status. The guards are trained professionals, and their role is to maintain order and protect the palace. What you did was not a mistake. It was an act of disrespect. We cannot ignore it. Here, however, no one was intimidated by his money or confidence. He opened his mouth to argue, but Ms. Harlow raised a hand, signaling that the discussion was over. Security officers had already reviewed footage of the incident, and there was no denying what had happened. Meanwhile, in the courtyard, tourists continued to react to what they had seen. Many took to social media immediately, posting videos and descriptions of the incident. Some expressed outrage, condemning Charles's behavior, while others praised Guard Jameson for his professionalism and composure. Within hours, the story began to spread beyond the palace, attracting attention from news outlets, travel bloggers, and ordinary citizens alike. In homes and offices across the city, people shook their heads at the video of a wealthy man behaving with such arrogance and impunity, while also admiring the dignity of the guard who had endured it without retaliation. Back in the office, Charles was asked to explain himself in more detail. He fumbled, unable to produce a convincing story. "I just wanted a better photo," he admitted reluctantly, though his tone still carried a sense of entitlement. "I didn't mean to upset anyone. It wasn't personal." Ms. Harlow listened carefully. She could see that Charles had never truly been held accountable for his actions in this way. His life of privilege had shielded him from consequences, and he had grown used to bending rules to suit his needs. This incident, however, was different. The palace was a place where tradition and respect were valued above wealth or status. After listening to Charles, Ms. Harlow turned to her team. "We need to handle this carefully but firmly," she said. "The palace cannot tolerate this behavior, but we also need to maintain our reputation. We cannot appear vindictive, but the law and our rules must be enforced." The officials discussed several options. Some suggested a public apology and a fine, while others argued for a more formal disciplinary action, considering the international attention the incident might attract. They finally agreed on a plan that would ensure Charles faced consequences without creating unnecessary scandal for the palace. Charles, however, was growing increasingly impatient. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice trembling slightly with frustration. "I didn't do anything that deserves all this attention. I'm a visitor. You can't make me feel bad about this." But no one listened to his complaints. The officers remained calm and professional, focused on their duty rather than his ego. They reminded him that his actions were not only disrespectful, but could also have legal implications. Guard Jameson, meanwhile, had been quietly observing the aftermath from a distance. He had returned to his post in the courtyard once the security officers had escorted Charles away, his composure unbroken. Visitors approached him cautiously, asking questions and offering words of respect. Children pointed at him in awe, whispering to their parents about how brave he was. Jameson nodded politely to everyone, maintaining the same disciplined demeanor that had impressed so many. He did not boast or seek attention, but the quiet strength he displayed spoke volumes. The palace also began to consider the international implications of the incident. Journalists and bloggers were already framing the story in different ways, some emphasizing the arrogance of Charles, others praising the dignity of the guard. Harlow realized that the palace had an opportunity not only to uphold its rules, but also to send a message about respect, discipline, and the importance of proper conduct. The incident, though unfortunate, could become a lesson for both visitors and citizens. As Charles sat in the office, he was informed of the consequences. He would be required to stay under supervision for the remainder of his visit, attend a cultural orientation program to understand the traditions and rules of the palace, and issue a formal apology to guard Jameson. He was also reminded that any attempt to leave without complying would result in legal action. For the first time in his life, Charles felt a sense of fear, not for his safety but for his reputation. His pride had been wounded, and he had been publicly exposed as a man who had let arrogance guide his actions. Outside, the courtyard slowly returned to normal. Tourists resumed their photos, children began to play, and the palace guards continued their duties as if nothing had happened. Yet, the memory of the incident lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. People continued to talk quietly among themselves, impressed by the calm demeanor of the guard and shaken by the audacity of the tourist. The story of the spitting incident had already begun to circulate far beyond the palace walls, and everyone knew it would be remembered for a long time. Charles, now left to reflect on his actions, realized that this was not a situation he could charm his way out of. The palace's rules, the professionalism of the guards, and the attention of the public had combined to teach him a lesson in humility. He had been used to controlling every situation, but here, his money and status were powerless. The realization was uncomfortable, but it was the first step in a journey that would challenge his attitude, his behavior, and his understanding of respect. Guard Jameson, for his part, returned to his duties with quiet pride. He did not seek recognition or rewards, but he understood the impact of his actions. By maintaining composure and professionalism, he had turned a moment of disrespect into a lesson for everyone present. Visitors would remember not only the arrogance of Charles, but also the dignity of the guard who had refused to be provoked. In that simple act of restraint, Jameson had demonstrated the power of patience, discipline, and moral courage. By the end of the day, the palace had restored order, and the courtyard was once again filled with tourists admiring the beauty of the grounds. Yet the story of Charles Whitmore and the Royal Guard had already taken on a life of its own. People shared videos, retold the events, and discussed the lessons learned. Charles had become a cautionary tale of arrogance and entitlement, while Guard Jameson had become a symbol of respect and self-control. As Charles waited for his orientation session later that day, he could not escape the reality of what had happened. Every reflection in the polished windows, every whisper from the palace staff, and every news update reminded him that his behavior had consequences. For the first time, he began to understand that respect could not be bought, and that actions, no matter how small, could have far-reaching effects. The arrogance that had guided his life until now had been challenged in the most public way possible, and he had no choice but to confront the consequences. The day ended with a quiet sense of reflection. Tourists left the palace with memories of beauty, history, and culture, but also with the story of a wealthy man humbled by his own arrogance and a guard whose calm strength had left a lasting impression. Charles, meanwhile, prepared for the next step of his journey, one that would test his patience, challenge his ego, and ultimately teach him the value of respect and humility. It was clear that the incident was far from over, and the lessons to be learned would unfold in ways he could never have anticipated. The morning after the incident, the palace courtyard was quieter than usual. Tourists arrived slowly, still talking about what had happened the day before. The videos and pictures of Charles Whitmore spitting on Guard Jameson had already gone viral. Phones everywhere buzzed with notifications. Social media was flooded with comments, some scolding Charles for his arrogance, others praising the guard for his self-control. News outlets across the country picked up the story, calling it a remarkable display of patience and dignity by the Royal Guard. It seemed the world could not get enough of the story. Inside the palace, Charles sat nervously in a private room. He had been informed that he would have to participate in a cultural and etiquette program. At first, he had laughed it off, thinking it was a formality he could skip or treat lightly. but the palace officials had made it clear this was not optional. The program was designed to teach visitors about the customs, traditions, and rules of the palace. It was also intended to give Charles an opportunity to understand the consequences of his actions and to guide him toward humility. For the first time, he felt a mixture of anger and anxiety. The instructor, a polite and knowledgeable woman named Ms. Patel, greeted Charles with a calm smile. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. Today, we will explore the traditions of this palace and the values we uphold. Our goal is not to punish, but to educate." Charles nodded stiffly, feeling a mix of impatience and curiosity. He had never been required to learn anything like this before. His life had been one of privilege, and he was used to being catered to rather than guided or corrected. Patel began by explaining the history of the palace, its significance, and the role of the guards. She showed him photographs of ceremonies, videos of formal events, and even examples of past incidents where decorum and respect had been upheld or breached. Charles listened half-heartedly at first, his mind focused on his own discomfort. But as the hours passed, he began to notice the care and dedication that the guards and palace staff put into maintaining their duties. He saw how much training, patience, and discipline were required to uphold the reputation of the palace. Slowly, he began to understand that the guards were not just performing a role, they were carrying on a tradition that demanded respect and honor. During a break, Charles wandered the courtyard alone, trying to reflect on what he had learned so far. The sun shone brightly, and the flowers in the garden seemed even more vibrant than before. He walked past the spot where he had spat on guard Jameson and felt a pang of shame. The memory of the guard's unwavering gaze, calm and composed despite the disrespect, weighed heavily on him. For the first time, Charles realized that no amount of money could command respect in a place where tradition and dignity were valued above all else. As the program continued, Ms. Patel introduced Charles to role-playing exercises. He had to practice greeting visitors, showing proper respect to staff, and even standing in a ceremonial formation like the guards. At first he stumbled, fumbling with the precise movements and feeling awkward. But with patient guidance, he began to improve. Each exercise reminded him of the importance of discipline, humility, and patience. Slowly, he began to understand that these skills were not just about appearances. They reflected character, integrity, and self-control. Meanwhile, news of Charles's forced participation in the cultural program spread. Social media users shared updates, often with humorous commentary, imagining a wealthy, arrogant man being taught etiquette and humility. Memes circulated, showing Charles awkwardly bowing or following ceremonial rules. Some people laughed, some sympathized, but all agreed that the story was a remarkable lesson in accountability. Charles, of course, was aware of the attention, and it added to his embarrassment. But he also could not deny that he was learning valuable lessons, even if he did not yet fully appreciate their depth. One afternoon, Ms. Patel arranged a meeting between Charles and guard Jameson. Charles felt nervous as he approached the guard, unsure of how to act. Jameson, as always, remained calm and professional. "Mr. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I understand that you have been learning about our customs and traditions. I hope this experience helps you understand the importance of respect and patience." Charles hesitated, then nodded. The words were simple, but they carried weight. The guard had not scolded him, nor had he sought revenge. He had only offered guidance, showing the strength of his character. Charles began to see the difference between arrogance and dignity, between impulsive behavior and thoughtful action. Over the next few days, Charles's lessons became more challenging. He participated in guided tour of the palace's most important rooms, learned about ceremonial protocols, and even attended a formal rehearsal for an upcoming event. At each step, he was reminded of the precision, patience, and respect required in such a place. He made mistakes frequently, often fumbling with gestures or mispronouncing traditional phrases. But Patel remained patient, offering guidance and encouragement rather than criticism. Charles began to realize that this was not just about following rules. It was about understanding values that had been cultivated over centuries. Outside the palace, the story continued to attract attention. Videos of Charles learning etiquette and participating in the program were shared widely. People were fascinated by the transformation of a man who had once acted with arrogance into someone, attempting to show respect and humility. The palace received letters of praise from citizens who admired the way the situation had been handled. Many noted that it was rare to see such a public example of education and accountability rather than punishment or shame. The story inspired discussions about respect, humility, and the responsibilities that come with wealth and privilege. For Charles, the experience was humbling. He had spent years believing that his money and status could protect him from consequences or criticism. Now, he was learning that true respect could not be bought, and that character mattered far more than appearance or wealth. He began to reflect on his past behavior, considering the times he had dismissed others, ignored rules, or treated people as inferior. Each memory weighed on him, but he realized that this experience was an opportunity to change, to learn, and to grow as a person. Guard Jameson continued to serve as an example. Even when Charles struggled or made mistakes, Jameson remained patient and professional, showing that true strength often came from restraint rather than anger. Charles noticed that the guard's calm demeanor did not come from weakness. It came from confidence, discipline, and a deep understanding of his role. It was a lesson that resonated deeply with Charles, who had often relied on intimidation or wealth to get his way. He began to understand that strength and respect were earned, not demanded. By the end of the program, Charles had transformed in ways he had not anticipated. He could perform basic ceremonial movements correctly, greet officials and staff with proper respect, and explain the significance of the palace's customs. But more importantly, he had begun to change internally. He had learned patience, humility, and the value of listening and observing before acting. The lessons went beyond etiquette. They were about character, integrity, and understanding one's place in a community. On the final day of the program, Charles and Ms. Patel returned to the courtyard. The same tourists who had witnessed the original incident were present, curious to see the outcome. Guard Jameson stood nearby, his presence calm and reassuring. Charles approached him with a deep breath. "Guard Jameson," he said, bowing slightly, "I want to apologize again for what I did. I acted without respect, and I understand now that my actions were wrong. Thank you for your patience and guidance." Jameson nodded, his expression unchanged but gentle. "Apology accepted, Mr. Whitmore. I hope this experience helps you in the future." Cameras clicked, not in shock or outrage this time, but to capture a moment of learning, growth, and dignity. Charles felt a strange mixture of relief and pride. He had faced the consequences of his actions, learned from them, and now had the chance to move forward with a greater understanding of respect and responsibility. News outlets quickly covered the final day of the program. Headlines read about the humbling journey of a wealthy tourist and praised the palace for handling the situation with grace and education rather than anger. Social media users shared videos of Charles's apology, highlighting the transformation from arrogance to humility. The story became more than a viral sensation. It became a lesson in accountability, patience, and the power of education over punishment. For Charles, the experience left a lasting impression. He realized that respect, patience, and humility were not weaknesses. They were strengths that could change lives, both for oneself and for others. He had been forced to confront his own behavior and learn in a way he never had before. The lessons he learned at the palace would stay with him forever, guiding his actions, shaping his character, and reminding him of the importance of dignity, self-control, and empathy. As the sun set over the palace, Charles reflected on the journey he had taken. The arrogant tourist who had spat on a royal guard had transformed into a man willing to learn, listen, and show respect. The courtyard, once the scene of humiliation, had become a place of growth and reflection. And while the story would continue to circulate and inspire others, the most important changes were happening within Charles himself. He had learned that true power did not come from wealth, privilege, or authority. It came from character, patience, and the courage to change. The morning air was crisp and filled with the soft rustle of leaves in the palace gardens. Charles Whitmore walked slowly through the familiar pathways, this time with a quiet confidence that was very different from the arrogance he had carried just days before. The courtyard, which had once been the scene of his public humiliation, now seemed peaceful and welcoming. Visitors wandered around, taking photos, enjoying the beauty, and admiring the grandeur of the palace. But Charles's focus was not on the scenery or the cameras this time. It was on an opportunity to make amends and show genuine respect for what he had learned. He approached Guard Jameson, who stood at his post as always, eyes forward, posture perfect, embodying the calm strength and discipline that had impressed Charles from the beginning. Charles paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. He remembered the first time he had seen Jameson that day, the stillness, the composure, and the dignity that had left him speechless. Now, after the cultural program, after the lessons in patience, humility, and respect, he felt prepared to face the guard once more, not as a man of wealth trying to assert power, but as someone who had learned a valuable lesson. "Guard Jameson," Charles said quietly, bowing slightly, "I want to apologize again for my behavior. I acted without thinking, without respect, and I realize now how wrong I was. I am truly sorry for what I did." Jameson turned his eyes toward Charles and gave a small nod. "Apology accepted, Mr. Whitmore. I hope that what you have learned here will guide your actions in the future," he said calmly. There was no anger in his voice, only a firm, measured tone that reflected the professionalism and dignity of a man who had endured insult but responded with composure. Charles felt a wave of relief and humility wash over him. He had expected confrontation, perhaps even anger, but instead he was met with grace and forgiveness. The realization struck him deeply. True respect could not be demanded, nor could it be bought. It was earned through actions, patience, and integrity. For the first time, he understood the value of these principles in a way that went beyond theory or stories. He had lived them, struggled with them, and now embraced them. As he stood there, some of the tourists who had witnessed the original incident approached cautiously. They had been following the story, curious to see whether Charles would change, whether he would show genuine remorse or try to escape the consequences once again. Now, seeing the humbled expression on his face, the sincere bow, and the careful tone of his voice, they nodded quietly to themselves, impressed by the transformation. Phones clicked, not to capture scandal or outrage, but to document a moment of learning and human growth. Parents whispered to their children about the importance of respect and patience, using the incident as a teaching moment. Charles spent the day reflecting on the lessons he had learned during his cultural and etiquette program. He walked through the palace gardens, revisiting the spots where he had first struggled to follow ceremonial movements, where he had made mistakes in greetings, and where he had felt awkward and out of place. Each memory reminded him that growth often came through struggle, and that humility was a strength rather than a weakness. He realized that his wealth and privilege, while useful in many areas of life, had never prepared him for a challenge like this, one that required internal reflection, patience, and the willingness to change. Ms. Patel met him later for a final review of the program. "Mr. Whitmore," she said kindly, "you have made significant progress. You understand not only our customs and traditions, but also the deeper values that guide this palace and its people. The most important lesson is that respect and humility matter more than any material wealth or social status. I hope you carry this with you wherever you go." Charles nodded, feeling gratitude and a sense of accomplishment. He realized that while the program had been challenging, it had been transformative, reshaping his perspective and giving him a deeper understanding of human dignity and responsibility. The palace staff, who had been observing Charles's progress, also noted the change. At first, they had been wary, unsure whether his lessons would stick. But over the past days, they had seen a man grow from arrogance to humility, from impulsive behavior to thoughtful reflection. It was a rare sight, they agreed, to witness such a dramatic transformation in a visitor. Many whispered among themselves that this would be a story to share with others, a tale of patience, education, and the power of self-improvement. Later in the day, the courtyard was filled with visitors once more. Charles stood quietly at a distance, watching the guards perform their duties, admiring their precision, discipline, and composure. He could see how much effort went into maintaining such order, how much training and dedication were required. He felt a deep respect for the men and women who carried these responsibilities with pride, realizing that their strength lay not just in their appearance or authority, but in their integrity, patience, and unwavering commitment to their role. Charles also began to think about his life outside the palace. He remembered moments when his arrogance and impulsive behavior had caused tension or hurt feelings. He thought of times when he had relied on money or influence to get his way rather than earning respect through his actions. Now, he understood that true growth required reflection, humility, and the courage to change. He made a mental promise to carry these lessons forward, to act with patience and respect in his personal and professional life, and to remember that dignity is built through actions, not wealth. By late afternoon, Charles requested to meet Guard Jameson once more. He wanted to express his gratitude in a meaningful way, beyond words. When he approached, Jameson looked at him with the same calm composure he had shown throughout the entire incident. Charles extended his hand. "Thank you, Guard Jameson. Your patience and guidance have taught me more than I can express. I hope to honor what I have learned not just here, but in my life going forward." Jameson nodded, shaking his hand briefly. There was no pride or condescension in the gesture, only acknowledgement and respect. News of Charles's apology and transformation spread quickly. Social media users shared updates, praising the palace for handling the situation with dignity and education. Headlines highlighted the story as an example of learning through accountability rather than punishment. The public admired both Charles's willingness to change and Guard Jameson's unwavering professionalism. The story became a symbol of how respect, patience, and guidance could lead to growth and understanding, even in the most challenging circumstances. As evening approached, Charles took a quiet walk through the palace grounds one last time. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the gardens and reflecting off the polished stone of the palace walls. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the experience. What had begun as a moment of shame and humiliation had transformed into a journey of learning, reflection, and personal growth. He realized that true wealth was not measured by money or possessions, but by character, humility, and the ability to respect and understand others. He paused at the spot where the incident had originally occurred, gazing at the familiar courtyard. Memories of embarrassment and anger were now replaced by reflection and appreciation. He understood that the incident would remain part of his story, but it would no longer be a source of shame. Instead, it had become a turning point, a moment that had challenged him, reshaped him, and helped him grow into a more thoughtful, respectful, and humble person. Guard Jameson continued his duties, maintaining the same calm and composed presence he had always shown. But now, Charles observed him not with resentment or arrogance, but with admiration and gratitude. He recognized the quiet strength it took to remain patient, the courage required to endure disrespect without retaliation, and the wisdom that came from guiding others with dignity. It was a lesson he would never forget, one that would influence his behavior and choices for years to come. By the end of the day, Charles had completed his formal obligations at the palace. He had apologized, learned, and reflected deeply. As he prepared to leave, he took a final glance at the grand building, the elegant gardens, and the stoic guards. He felt a sense of closure and accomplishment, knowing that he had faced the consequences of his actions and emerged with a new understanding of respect, patience, and humility. The tourists who had witnessed the original incident also left with new lessons. Many shared their thoughts with friends and family about the importance of patience, humility, and respect for tradition. The story of Charles Whitmore and Gard Jameson became more than just a viral moment. It became a teaching story, a reminder that dignity and character mattered more than wealth or privilege. People marveled at the transformation, inspired by the power of education, reflection, and personal growth. As Charles departed the palace, he reflected on how much he had changed in just a few days. He had learned to pause before acting, to respect rules and traditions, and to value the guidance and patience of others. He knew that life would continue to challenge him, but he felt equipped with a new perspective, a deeper understanding of humility, and a commitment to act with dignity and respect. What had once been a moment of arrogance and impulsiveness had become an unforgettable lesson that would stay with him forever. The palace courtyard, now quiet in the fading light, remained a symbol of the lessons learned. Gard Jameson continued his watch, calm and steady, embodying the values that had inspired a transformation. Charles Whitmore, once an arrogant tourist, left the palace not only with memories of its grandeur, but with a new sense of self-awareness, humility, and respect for others. The story of the incident, the cultural program, and the ultimate lesson of respect and patience would be remembered by all who witnessed it and shared as an example of how personal growth can emerge from the most unexpected experiences. In the end, what began as a moment of disrespect had evolved into a story of reflection, learning, and personal transformation. Charles had been humbled, educated, and inspired to act with greater integrity. Gard Jameson had demonstrated the power of patience and dignity. Together, their story became a lasting lesson that respect, humility, and character are qualities that endure, shaping not only individual lives but the way society views true strength and leadership.